We begin with a massive manhunt in France. Authorities narrowed the search to northern France after the two brothers believed responsible for the massacre at the Charlie Hebdo newspaper robbed a gas station 50 miles north of Paris early Thursday before fleeing again, reportedly on foot into a wooded area. U.S. officials said that one of the brothers, 34-year-old Saeed Kouachi, received terrorist training from al-Qaeda in Yemen. His 32-year-old brother, Sharif, was once featured in a documentary as an aspiring rapper and spent time in a French prison on terrorism charges. Both brothers have been on the U.S. no-fly list for years. We'll have more on the terrorism and the counterterrorism angles of the story in a moment. But first, the fiery debate this has sparked over freedom of speech. A radical cleric in London, Anjem Choudary, tweeted soon after Wednesday's attack, "Freedom of expression does not extend to insulting the prophets of Allah, whatever your views on the events in Paris today." And it wasn't just fringe extremists who expressed that opinion. An op-ed in the Financial Times said some common sense would be useful at publications such as Charlie Hebdo, which purport to strike a blow for freedom when they provoke Muslims. Both received a fierce backlash online. But where is the line between religious sensitivity and freedom of expression? Let's bring in Nina Burley from Washington, D.C. She's an award-winning investigative journalist who just wrote about the subject in Newsweek with a piece entitled, "After Charlie Hebdo, Moderate Islam Must Speak Out." Then from Phoenix, we are joined by Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He joins us, he's the president, of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy and the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. It is very good to have you both with us. Dr. Jasser, I'll start with you. There have been many, not just Muslims, who have expressed the feeling that you're provoking extremists, so what do you expect? But isn't that blaming the victim? Are these people trying to have it both ways by saying, what do you expect if you publish something offensive, and then on the other hand, we think their murder's wrong?
Well, there's no doubt that that's quite hypocritical, and that the test of a free society is the fact that, as the New York Times piece also mentioned, it said blasphemy is really the test of a society, and it's that speech that incites violence that really tests the limits of really whether you live in a liberal society. And as a Muslim, I don't want to be infantilized by society where, oh, treat us Muslims with kid gloves. You can have Broadway plays that demonize Mormonism. You can criticize Judaism and Christianity and have offensive art about Christians, but don't do it against Muslims because they'll be violent. I want to be treated equally, and I think I want to belong to a faith that gets treated in a way that's in the 21st century and not the 15th century. And unfortunately, when we make excuses and say that they're inciting it, you're basically saying that the religion that I believe the Prophet Muhammad taught was that people could come and go as they pleased, apostasy wasn't convicted, but we have a lot of reform to do, and we have to acknowledge that we have a problem.
Nina, you wrote that Islamic extremism can't coexist with Western ideals and that moderate Muslims must speak out. Many have, but what would you say to moderate Muslims who may not agree with Dr. Jasser, who do repudiate the murder, but say they can't stand with the French satirical magazine, that freedom of speech comes with responsibilities?
Well, what I would say to them first is, right here, pen mightier than the sword. There are hundreds of thousands of Muslims, if not millions of Muslims, voting with their feet this year, last year, over the years, getting in boats, filling boats to sinking in the Mediterranean to get to the shores of a society in which words, not violence, are used to settle differences, okay? So that's the first thing. Moderate Muslims need to feel supported, that, we are paying attention to them. Those poor people in Raqqa and in Mosul who are under the grip of these goons, I hope that they're able to understand that there are people who are writing about them and who are speaking for them and who are speaking out against this really a fascistic mentality. So free speech is something that I think moderate Muslims want. And I think that it's just a matter of enough people like Dr. Jasser and others coming forward and having the courage to speak out against this small and virulent strain
and Dr.
within
Jasser,
the system.
But to Nina's point, there are so many Muslims have voted with their feet, have left countries where there is extremism and come to the West. So are the extremists, in fact, is that their objective, that they're forcing people to pick a side here by saying religious beliefs trump beliefs that are secular?
There's no doubt that one of the goals of terrorists, and remember, one of the people killed at this magazine was a Muslim who was one of the copy editors. The police officer first killed point blank was Muslim. So they want to make it very uncomfortable for Muslims to live in this society by saying that Muslims have a divide between the Western modernity versus the Islam. But many Muslims, as Egyptians proved that went to the streets in Revolution 2.0 in Egypt, they don't want the Brotherhood, the Islamists running government. They don't want the Islamists dominating and telling them what is and what is not blasphemy. And if you remember, Morsi declared criticism of the president to being equivalent to criticism of Islam. And that's the slippery slope. And I would tell you that if we make this narrative just about terror, terror is a symptom. Under that iceberg is a much bigger problem, which is the fuel of this control of speech where government becomes, and this is why our organization, the American Islamic Forum, is founded on the separation of mosque and state. Unless you put an end to all Islamic states, you will not be able to defeat the fuel with which blasphemy laws, apostasy laws get their inspiration, because once you have an Islamic state, any speech against the state becomes sedition. And that's why secular states, and me as a Muslim, as a secular Muslim who loves my faith, I fight against the Islamo-patriots who believe in the Islamic State and jihad by saying that my loyalty, I would want to die for America. I would not want to die for an Islamic State that believes in jihad. My jihad is personal between me and God.
But one of the problems here, Nina, is something you point out, something we referred to last night here as a vicious circle when we were talking to the head of CARE, that the extremists want to incite anger in Europe because then there could be a backlash against Muslims and that could lead to more recruits.
Clearly, that's the goal here, and unfortunately, it appears that that's there's so much simmering anger. These countries, all of these European countries, are under an enormous economic stress right now, and that always pits the lower class against the lower class. So you do have a situation that's ripe for a kind of a backlash, and of course that's going to occur here. That's what these people want, and one hopes that people will come together and not respond that way. I think there were a couple of attacks already today, but I think listening to Dr. Jasser, I think everybody should once again let's tone down the rhetoric, let's tone down the conversation here a little bit, and remember these are a small minority of a large group of billions of people who believe in a certain religion, and they're not all coming after cartoonists with Kalashnikovs.
Of course, but a lot of people on both sides aren't toning it down. Let's listen to something Bill Maher said Wednesday night.
Hundreds of millions of them support an attack like this. They applaud an attack like this. What they say is, oh, we don't approve of violence, but you know what? When you make fun of the prophet, all bets are off.
Now, Maher is obviously, as Nina said, exaggerating greatly, but isn't this the danger, that a whole civilization, the whole Muslim world, will be blamed as condoning this violence? So what is the responsibility of the hundreds of millions of Muslims who actually reject the violence, Dr. Jasser?
Well, I think the responsibility is to get beyond denial and recognize that there's a fuel for this radicalism. Yes, they're not militants, but remember, this newspaper, this magazine, was being sued by Islamist groups in France. Non-violent group, mind you, but Islamists that wanted to sue them, to put them in jail, as some have in Europe, for defaming the Quran, defaming Islam. That's the slippery slope, where all of a sudden you have some militants say, well, I'm going to show them, and then they kill them in a terrorist act. So underneath this is a need to reform and say, we need to come to terms with modernity and no longer control speech. The Western standard is Brandenburg versus Ohio, in which unless somebody openly calls for the death and murder of an individual or violence openly, the rest is free speech. And we Muslims need to have large movements in which we condemn Azhar and other major Islamic institutions out of Saudi Arabia and elsewhere that are advocating for control of speech and infantilizing Muslims.
Right, and either you don't. The doctor mentioned the New York Times op-ed, a very powerful one. It said at one point, if a large enough group of someones is willing to kill you for saying something, then it's something that almost certainly needs to be said, because otherwise the violent have veto power over liberal civilization, and when that scenario obtains, it isn't really a liberal civilization anymore. I'm sure you agree with that point. A final word, Nina?
Well said. I mean, the way I ended my piece yesterday is, you know, there are many, many men and women in this world who will never, ever have power. And that is why it's so important to have the ability to speak truth to power, and laughing at power is a human right.
Nina Burley, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, very good of you both to join us to share your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you.